Edward Harrow had never loved the sound of silence, but in the gilded apartment on Kensington's Harrington Gardens, silence was all he owned. The clocks ticked faintly against panelled walls, echoing louder than they should have in rooms far too big for one man. Marble fireplaces, oil portraits, and velvet drapes spoke of wealth, but Edward moved through them like a ghost haunting someone else's home. He was 32 and already burdened by the weight of a family name carved long before he was born. His father, Richard Harrow, had left a reputation for shrewd investments and merciless ambition, but little affection for the son who bore his name. The empire passed to Richard's sister, Margaret, who carried it with a hand as steady as steel. For Edward, that meant every luxury around him was borrowed. Clothes, cars, even the roof over his head. Granted not by right, but by her allowance. At night, when the city glowed beneath him, Edward would pour whiskey and stare through the tall windows at London's endless streets. He wondered if any of those lights belonged to men who envied him. They saw the Harrow name and imagined power, but Edward knew the truth. He was an heir in title only, chained by dependence. Still, he wore the mask well. In clubs, at galleries, at the kind of dinners where champagne never stopped flowing, Edward played the role of a careless aristocrat. His laughter rang too loud, his gestures too sharp. Inside, however, the bitterness spread. Each time his aunt summoned him, her words cut deeper than she knew. Margaret Harrow was not unkind, but her affection was measured, conditional. She praised him when he mirrored his father's ruthlessness, but scolded him when he stumbled, and he stumbled often. Gambling debts, half-finished ventures, companions she called undesirable. She never raised her voice, but her disapproval weighed more heavily than any shouted curse. The city beyond the windows felt alive, humming with possibility, but Edward could not cross into it freely. Every choice had to be approved, every expense justified. He lived in Kensington, yes, but in a cage lined with silk. One evening, as rain softened the stone streets outside, Edward lingered in his study, letters unopened on the desk. A newspaper lay folded to the finance pages. Another headline about Margaret's ventures, profits rising, her empire expanding. His name, once linked to hers, was now missing. The omissions stung more than the words themselves, he muttered into the empty room, voice hoarse from drink. They don't even mention me anymore. The walls offered no reply, only the rain tapping the glass. A steady reminder that the world outside carried on without him. He thought of his father's portrait in the mansion. Stern eyes, a mouth carved into permanent judgment. Edward often felt that gaze pressing on him, whispering failure. A knock startled him. The butler entered, discreet as always. "Your aunt wishes to see you tomorrow. Tea at 4. Edward nodded, dismissing the man with a wave, but once the door closed, his hands trembled. A summons from Margaret rarely meant comfort. She wielded such meetings as weapons, gentle, polite weapons, but sharp nonetheless. That night he lay awake, mind restless. He tried to imagine what she wanted. Another lecture, another warning about his choices, perhaps a reminder that her patience was not infinite. Beneath the weight of those thoughts, Edward closed his eyes, but sleep brought no peace. He dreamed of corridors stretching endlessly, of doors locked against him, of voices behind them deciding his fate. When morning came, he dressed carefully, as though armor could be woven from linen and silk. The carriage ride to his aunt's mansion would be short, but in his chest, dread swelled. Tomorrow's tea promised nothing sweet. The Harrow mansion stood like a fortress on the edge of Holland Park, its gates wrought in black iron, its windows glittering with the kind of authority that had weathered a century. Edward arrived just before 4, his nerves wrapped in silk gloves and a tailored suit that felt too tight around the throat. The butler led him through the hall of portraits, each face a stern reminder of lineage. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and aged books. Edward's gaze lingered on his father's painting, hung directly opposite the staircase. The familiar eyes seemed to narrow as he passed. In the drawing room, Margaret Harrow waited. She was seated by the tall bay window, the afternoon light softening the silver in her hair, but not the severity in her posture. A porcelain tea set rested on the low table, steam rising from a pot as though it had been poured at the exact second of his arrival. Margaret was never imprecise. "Edward," she greeted, her voice calm but clipped. "Sit," he obeyed, lowering himself into the chair across from her. He smiled faintly, though his palms were damp. "It's been some time, Aunt. You look well." I am well, she replied, pouring the tea with a hand that did not tremble. The question is whether you are. The cups clinked softly. Edward lifted his, more to keep his hands busy than to drink. He could feel her gaze pressing into him, searching for weakness. I've been keeping busy, he offered. Looking into opportunities, a property venture in Mayfair perhaps. Margaret arched a brow, the barest flicker of skepticism. I hear whispers, Edward, whispers of debts, of associates who might not survive scrutiny. Your father would be dismayed. Her words struck with the precision of a blade. Edward's smile faltered. My father is gone, and I am not him. No, she said softly, almost with pity. You are not. The silence that followed stretched taut. Margaret lifted her cup, her every movement refined, rehearsed. Edward felt clumsy by comparison, a schoolboy caught in a lie. I only want to live with some freedom, he murmured, staring at the steam curling from his tea. Not every choice measured against his shadow. Or yours, Margaret set her cup down carefully. Freedom without discipline is ruin. You were given every advantage, Edward, yet you drift. I do not scold because I despise you. I scold because you must face consequence before consequence finds you. Her words carried no malice, yet they cut deeper than anger. Edward swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He wanted to shout, to accuse her of cruelty, but instead he forced another smile. I understand, he said. I'll do better. But she looked at him as though she did not believe it. Perhaps she never had. The tea cooled between them. Conversation dwindled into polite fragments, investments, art exhibitions, the upcoming season in the countryside. Yet beneath every word, Edward felt the same message thrumming. You are not enough. When the butler finally entered to clear the table, Edward rose too quickly, nearly toppling his cup. Margaret noticed, of course. She noticed everything. As she stood to dismiss him, her hand brushed his arm. For a fleeting second, Edward thought he felt tenderness there. But when he met her eyes, all he saw was calculation. Take care, Edward, she said. Choices have a way of catching up. The carriage ride back to Kensington was silent, but for the pounding in his ears. Her words replayed again and again, twisting themselves into questions. What choices? What consequences? By the time he returned to his apartment, dusk had fallen. He stood at the window, whiskey in hand, and told himself she was bluffing. Yet unease coiled tighter in his chest. Somewhere in the house of his aunt, secrets brewed, and Edward suspected they had everything to do with him. The following week, Edward returned to the mansion under far less formal circumstances. His aunt had invited several family acquaintances for supper, a smaller gathering, but no less suffocating. Edward arrived late, half distracted, and half hoping Margaret would chastise him, so he might rebel against her restraint. The dinner passed in a haze of polite conversation. Laughter spilled easily around the polished table, though none of it reached Edward. He drank steadily, trying to find comfort in the bite of wine. Margaret was cordial, even charming, but her sharp glances at him suggested a deeper script she hadn't shared. After the meal, the guests dispersed into drawing rooms and libraries. Edward wandered aimlessly, lingering near the corridor that led to Margaret's study. From behind its half-closed door came muffled voices, hers and another man's. Curious, Edward leaned closer, heart tightening at the familiarity of the second voice. It belonged to Mr. Turner, the family solicitor. It must be finalized before the end of the month, Turner said. Margaret's reply was quieter, but the words carried enough weight to strike like thunder. Yes, the estate must be protected. He cannot continue as beneficiary. Edward froze. A single word, beneficiary, echoed in his skull, blotting out the rest of the conversation. He pressed closer, his breath shallow. Turner's voice again. You are certain? It is quite decisive. I am certain, Margaret answered. Edward lacks judgment. The legacy deserves stability, not indulgence. Edward staggered back as though struck. His name, spoken with such finality, cut deeper than any blade. His aunt's tone held no hesitation, no love, only cold resolution. He retreated silently down the corridor, his pulse hammering in his throat. The clink of glasses and chatter from the drawing room sounded distant, unreal. He forced a mask back onto his face before rejoining the others, but the world had shifted under his feet. Later that night, in his Kensington apartment, Edward poured whiskey until the glass overflowed. The rain outside smudged the city lights, turning London into a blurred painting. He replayed the words again and again, each repetition fanning his paranoia. He cannot continue as beneficiary. The phrase spiraled into nightmare visions. His allowance gone, his flat reclaimed, his name erased from the family legacy. The Harrow fortune would pass into other hands. He would become nothing more than a cautionary tale. He tried to reason with himself, muttering into the empty room. Perhaps she meant someone else. Perhaps I misunderstood. But the memory of her voice, steady and certain, crushed any hope. The following days, Edward haunted his own thoughts. He cancelled outings, ignored calls, and drank until dawn. Each creak of the floorboards, each knock on the door, filled him with dread. He imagined Turner drafting new papers, Margaret signing her name with a flourish, erasing him from history. He even considered confronting her, marching into the mansion and demanding the truth. But the thought of her gaze, sharp and merciless, made him falter. Instead, he brooded in silence, his resentment growing by the hour. At one point, Clara visited. She found him dishevelled, curtains drawn, cigarette smoke clouding the room. "You look unwell," she said softly, brushing his arm. "What's happened?" Edward hesitated, torn between confession and secrecy. Finally, he shook his head. "Nothing you need concern yourself with." But Clara's eyes lingered, searching. He turned away before she could see the fury burning beneath his skin. When she left, the silence returned, heavier than before. Edward stood by the window until his reflection blurred with the night. Somewhere in the mansion, Margaret and her solicitor plotted the course of his future, and Edward, trapped in a gilded cage, began to imagine what he might do to shatter it. The storm broke 2 nights later. London's streets glistened under a relentless rain, carriages splashing through puddles, lamps glowing faint against the downpour. Edward had been pacing his apartment for hours, the solicitor's words circling in his mind like a curse. At last, his desperation outweighed his fear. He needed proof. Margaret's study, the one room in the mansion forbidden to him, was the only place such proof might exist. He told himself he would only look, only confirm what he already suspected. Yet as he slipped into his coat and hailed a cab, a darker thrill pulsed in his veins. It felt like crossing a threshold, one from which he could not return. The mansion was quiet when he arrived. Most of the staff had retired. Only a single lamp glowed in the vestibule. Edward moved like a trespasser in his own bloodline, his footsteps muffled by thick carpets. He knew the house's every creak, every shadow, yet tonight it seemed foreign, hostile. The study door was locked. Of course it was. Margaret trusted no one, but Edward had watched the butler often enough to know where the keys were kept. A small drawer in the servants' corridor. With trembling hands, he retrieved them and returned, heart pounding with the reckless certainty of discovery. Inside, the room smelled of paper and old leather, heavy curtains drawn against the storm. Shelves towered with ledgers and files, Margaret's meticulous empire catalogued in ink. The desk, polished to a dark gleam, bore neat stacks of correspondence. Edward rifled through drawers, each creak louder than thunder. Contracts, receipts, invitations, mundane, infuriatingly mundane. He nearly gave up when his fingers brushed against a sealed envelope tucked beneath a ledger. His name, Edward James Harrow, was written in Margaret's hand across the front. For a moment, he only stared, breath shallow. Then, with a decisive tear, he broke the seal. The words inside struck harder than any blow. "This is to confirm that Edward James Harrow shall no longer be a beneficiary of the Harrow estate. In the event of my passing, the estate and holdings shall be entrusted to Charles Whitmore, cousin to the late Richard Harrow, whose judgment and sobriety have proven worthy of the family's legacy." Edward read it once, then again, the ink blurring through his tears. His name erased, his future replaced by Charles Whitmore, a man he barely knew. A cousin who had hovered on the periphery like a shadow and now stood ready to inherit his life. The rage rose quickly, uncontrollably. His hands shook, the letter trembling like a living thing between them. He whispered hoarsely into the empty room, "She's taken everything, everything." For a fleeting second he considered replacing the envelope, leaving no trace. But the thought of returning to Kensington, pretending nothing had changed, was unbearable. He folded the letter into his coat pocket, as though keeping the betrayal close could harden him against it. Behind him, thunder cracked, rattling the windows. Edward nearly dropped the lamp he carried. His nerves screamed that someone would find him here, that Margaret herself would step through the door at any moment. He hurriedly replaced the keys, retraced his path, and slipped back into the rain-soaked streets. By the time he returned to his apartment, midnight had passed. He set the letter on his desk, staring at it as though it might change under his gaze, but the words remained, cold and certain. Edward poured whiskey until his vision swam. He imagined confronting Margaret, demanding answers, clawing back what was his. He imagined Charles smirking in victory, stepping into shoes Edward had worn since childhood, and beneath it all, he felt something darker stirring, an impulse to strike before everything was taken away. When dawn broke pale over London, Edward had not slept. The letter lay where he had left it, a silent testament to betrayal. He buttoned his coat, slipped the envelope inside once more, and muttered to himself, "This isn't over, not by a long mile." Clara found him in the same place she always did. Slouched in the armchair of his Kensington flat, the curtains drawn, the air heavy with smoke and stale whiskey, she entered quietly, her presence a flicker of warmth in the otherwise suffocating gloom. "You haven't been out in days," she murmured, pulling off her gloves. "I was worried." Edward didn't look at her. He held the folded letter in one hand like a talisman, his thumb rubbing the crease until the paper frayed. His voice was low, almost hoarse. "She's cut me out, Clara, my own blood. Everything gone, handed to Whitmore." Clara blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Your aunt? You mean the will?" He thrust the letter toward her, his eyes gleaming with a feverish mix of anger and despair. "I saw it with my own eyes. She erased me, as though I never existed." Clara hesitated before taking the paper. She read it slowly, lips parting in disbelief. Her silence stretched long enough for Edward to rise, pacing like a man caged. "She's been planning this for months, I'm sure of it, waiting for me to stumble, to prove her right. And Whitmore, he's probably laughing already, savouring what's mine." Clara set the letter on the table, her hands trembling. "Edward, this is terrible, yes, but it's not the end. You're still alive, still free to make your own path. You don't need her money to be, don't you see?" He snapped, turning on her with sudden ferocity. "It's not about money. It's about legacy. About who I am. Without it, I'm nothing. Just another ruined aristocrat with debts and shadows. She's destroyed me." The words hung heavy in the air. Clara's eyes glistened, but she steadied her voice. "You're not nothing. You're more than her approval. More than your family's name." For a moment, Edward faltered. The gentleness in her tone pierced through his rage, but only briefly. He turned away, staring at the rain streaking the window. "You wouldn't understand. You never lived under their eyes, their rules." Every breath weighed, every misstep recorded. Clara rose and moved closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I understand, love. I understand choosing your own life instead of letting them define it. Stay with me, Edward. Walk away from all this." He laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. "Walk away? Into what? Poverty? Obscurity? My father's ghost would laugh. Margaret would win, and Whitmore would inherit everything. I'd rather die." Clara flinched, withdrawing her hand. Her eyes darkened with fear. "Don't say that. Don't even think it." But Edward's gaze was distant, fixed on some vision only he could see. His hands clenched at his sides, knuckles pale. "She thinks she's clever, that she can erase me. But she forgets. I'm still here. I can act. I can... Stop this!" "Edward," Clara whispered, her voice shaking now. "You're scaring me." He turned suddenly, gripping her wrist. His eyes burned with desperation. "Then tell me, what am I supposed to do? Accept it? Smile while they bury me alive? Or fight back?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She shook her head, pulling free from his grasp. "Not like this. Don't let anger consume you. If you fight her with violence, you'll lose more than the will. You'll lose yourself." Her words echoed in the quiet flat. Edward stood motionless, breathing hard. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. But when Clara left, her footsteps fading down the stairwell, the silence returned, heavier than before. Edward poured another drink, staring at the letter that lay accusingly on the table. He whispered into the shadows, voice trembling with resolve and despair alike. "She won't take everything from me. I won't let her." The Harrow mansion glowed with chandeliers that evening, laughter and clinking glasses echoing through its grand halls. To outsiders, it was another elegant family dinner, a celebration of tradition. To Edward, it was a masquerade, every polished smile concealing knives. He arrived deliberately late, forcing all eyes to fall upon him as he entered the dining room. The guests were already seated around the long mahogany table. Margaret sat at the head, regal in deep green silk, a queen presiding over her court. To her right, Charles Whitmore, Edward's cousin, and the name on the cursed letter, smiled with infuriating ease. "Ah, Edward," Margaret said, her tone cool but polite. "We thought you might not come." He bowed his head slightly, masking the bitterness that burned inside. "I wouldn't dream of missing such an occasion." The servants poured wine, silverware gleamed, and dishes arrived in flawless sequence. Yet Edward tasted nothing. His gaze shifted constantly between Margaret and Charles, watching the silent exchange of approval in their glances. Each nod, each word of praise for Charles's new ventures was a dagger. Charles leaned forward during the first course, speaking loudly enough for the table. "I've been in discussions about expanding holdings in Manchester. A risky move, perhaps, but one must be bold in uncertain times." Margaret's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Yes, boldness tempered with wisdom. That is what preserves a legacy." Edward's hand tightened around his fork until his knuckles whitened. He forced himself to speak, his voice laced with false cheer. "And what of recklessness? Surely that has its place too. Where would fortune lie without a little daring?" The table went quiet for a heartbeat, tension shimmering in the air. Margaret did not look at him. She kept her eyes on her plate. Charles chuckled lightly, diffusing the silence. "True, cousin, but daring is only admirable when it succeeds." The words landed like a slap. Edward raised his glass, smiling thinly. "Well said." He drained it in one swallow, the wine burning down his throat like fire. As the evening dragged on, Edward felt the walls closing in. Conversations flowed around him, but he could hear only fragments. Inheritance, expansion, stability. Each word fed the storm inside him. He saw his father's portrait hanging above the fireplace, its painted eyes bearing down as though condemning his weakness. Margaret eventually turned to him, her tone deceptively light. "And what of you, Edward? How have you occupied yourself of late?" He smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I occupy myself quite well, Aunt. Drinking, gambling, disappointing you. The usual." Gasps rippled softly around the table. Margaret's expression remained composed, but her eyes hardened. "Sarcasm does not become you, Edward." "No," he said, voice lowering, "but neither does betrayal." The room froze. Even the servants hesitated in their steps. For a moment, it seemed Edward might press further, reveal the letter, expose her in front of them all. But then he laughed, sharp and hollow, waving his hand as though dismissing a jest. "Forgive me," he said. "Too much wine." The dinner resumed, but the damage was done. Edward sat in silence, fury simmering beneath his skin. Every tick of the clock, fueling the inevitability of confrontation. He no longer cared for appearances. He no longer cared for civility. By the time dessert was served, he had decided the truth would be spoken, whether Margaret wished it or not. That night, as he left the mansion, the autumn air cut cold against his flushed skin. He knew the next meeting with his aunt would not end in polite exchanges. It would end in fire. The rain had not stopped since that dinner. Edward watched it streak the windows of his apartment, each drop carving a path like the thoughts cutting through his mind. The words he had swallowed at the table now festered, demanding release. He could not pretend any longer. When Margaret summoned him the following afternoon, he went without hesitation. The butler led him once more to the drawing room, but this time Edward did not sit immediately. He stood by the fire, his back to her, watching the flames twist and flare. "You asked for me," he said. His voice trembled only slightly. "Yes," Margaret replied, her tone composed as ever. "We need to speak frankly." He turned, eyes dark. At last, she studied him for a moment before gesturing to the chair opposite hers. "Sit, Edward." "No," he said, pacing instead. "Not until you tell me why. Why you've decided to cut me out, to hand everything to Charles. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Margaret's expression did not change. Only her hands, folded neatly in her lap, tightened slightly. "So, you searched my study." "I had to," he snapped. "You left me no choice. You've been plotting to erase me from the beginning." "You left me no choice," she corrected, her voice sharper now. "Every mistake, every scandal, every debt. You have proven time and again, you cannot be trusted with what our family built." Edward's laugh was harsh, brittle. "So you would rather give it to Whitmore, a parasite who's done nothing, who never bore the weight of this name?" Margaret rose, her height and poise commanding the room. Charles understands discipline. He understands responsibility. Two qualities you have consistently rejected. Edward stepped closer, his face flushed with fury. Discipline? Responsibility? You mean obedience. You mean bending to your will, dancing to your tune. That's all you've ever wanted. You confuse guidance with tyranny, she said coldly. I tried to give you the chance to grow, but you squandered it. Her calmness enraged him more than any shout could have. He slammed his fist against the mantel, sending a porcelain figure toppling to the floor. It shattered with a sharp crack. Margaret did not flinch. This is exactly what I mean. Violence, recklessness, destruction. You are proving me right even now. His breath came heavy, uneven. You've ruined me. Do you understand that? Without the estate, I am nothing. You've left me to rot while Charles steps into my place. Margaret's eyes softened for the briefest second, but her words remained firm. Edward, listen to yourself. If your worth depends on an inheritance, then you have already failed. Something inside him broke. He staggered back, clutching his hair, torn between rage and despair. I could have been great. I could have carried his name, our name. But you never believed in me. You never once saw me as more than a disappointment. Finally, Margaret's voice wavered, low but steady. Because you never gave me reason to. The silence that followed was unbearable. Edward's chest rose and fell like a man drowning. He wanted to scream, to strike, to make her take back every word. Instead, he stood trembling, his fists clenched so tightly, his nails dug into his palms. Margaret turned away, signaling the conversation was over. Go home, Edward. Sober yourself. Learn humility. It may be all you have left. He stared at her back, his vision blurring with tears of rage. The fire crackled between them, mocking his helplessness. At last, he spun on his heel and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. As he crossed the marble hall, one thought pulsed in his mind, dark and relentless. If she meant to destroy him, he would not go quietly. The storm inside had reached its breaking point. The storm outside had gathered strength by the time Edward returned to the mansion. Rain hammered the slate roof, wind rattled the iron gates. The world seemed to conspire in violence, a mirror to the fury consuming him. He moved quickly through the shadows, his coat soaked, his shoes leaving wet prints across the marble floor. The servants had long since retired. Only the occasional creak of the old house marked his passage. He paused at the foot of the grand staircase, breath rising in sharp bursts. Above him, the corridor stretched toward Margaret's chambers. He could almost hear her voice already, calm, measured, condemning. Every step upward felt like defiance, like marching into battle. At her door he hesitated, fingers trembling against the brass handle. For a fleeting second, doubt flickered. If he turned back now, perhaps nothing would be lost. But then the memory of the letter returned, the ink burning in his mind. His fate had already been sealed. He pushed the door open. Margaret sat upright in bed, lamp still burning beside her. She looked neither startled nor afraid, only mildly inconvenienced, as if she had expected this intrusion. Edward, she said softly, what foolishness brings you here at this hour? His voice cracked with the weight of it. You've ruined me, Aunt. You've taken everything. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. I gave you every chance. You squandered them all. He stepped closer, dripping rain onto the carpet, his hands trembling. You had no right. It was mine. My father's legacy. Mine. Margaret's eyes narrowed. A legacy is not given. It is earned. You were never willing to earn it. Something inside him snapped. He lunged forward, seizing her wrist as she reached for the bell beside her bed. She gasped, struggling against his grip, but he was stronger, driven by a desperation that bordered on madness. Don't you dare erase me, he growled, his face inches from hers. I am a Harrow. I am your blood. Her composure faltered then, fear flashing in her eyes. Edward, stop. This is not the way. But he no longer heard her. His hands moved of their own accord, one clamping around her throat, pressing her back against the pillows. Margaret thrashed, clawing at his sleeves, her breath rasping in short, desperate bursts. The lamp flickered, casting their struggle in grotesque shadows across the walls. Edward pressed harder, teeth clenched, tears blurring his vision. Her lips moved, trying to form words, pleas, curses. He could not tell. And then suddenly her movements slowed. Her hands fell limp against the sheets. The room fell silent, but for Edward's ragged breathing. He released her, stumbling back. The weight of what he had done crashed over him. Margaret lay motionless, her face pale, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The matriarch of the Harrow legacy, The woman who had ruled his life was gone. For a long moment, he stood frozen, chest heaving, the storm outside battering the windows. He expected triumph, some dark satisfaction. Instead, there was only emptiness, a hollow space where rage had burned itself out. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, indifferent to murder. Edward staggered to the desk, pouring himself a drink with shaking hands. He downed it in one swallow, but the burn did nothing to steady him. He turned back toward the bed. Margaret's body looked impossibly small, diminished, stripped of the authority that had once filled the room. The sight unnerved him. He pulled the covers up to her chin, as if hiding the evidence could erase the truth. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the chamber in a violent flash. In that moment, Edward saw himself reflected in the mirror above the fireplace. Dishevelled, wild-eyed, monstrous. He could no longer recognize the man staring back. He fled the room, leaving the door ajar, the storm swallowing the sound of his retreat. Each step echoed through the mansion like a confession he could never take back. By the time he stumbled into the night, rain plastering his hair to his forehead, he knew there was no return. He had crossed the line between heir and criminal, between victim and killer. The storm had claimed more than the city. It had claimed his soul. The first thing Clara noticed when she arrived was the silence. The usual city hum, muffled by rain, seemed absent. Edward's apartment smelled of smoke and something metallic faint beneath it, a scent she couldn't place until she saw him. He sat slouched in the armchair, coat soaked, eyes wild, trembling slightly as he held a glass of whiskey like a talisman. "Edward?" Her voice was soft, cautious, but it carried an edge of alarm. He looked up, startled, then met her gaze with a mixture of relief and desperation. "Clara, I... He stopped, swallowing hard, unable to finish the sentence. She crossed the room quickly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What happened? You look..." Her voice trailed off, fear overtaking words. "I did it," he finally whispered, barely audible. "Margaret, she's gone." Clara recoiled, the glass slipping from her hand. "Gone? Edward, what do you mean?" He held up a trembling hand, his eyes pleading. I went to her room. She was alive at first, but His voice broke. He could not continue. Clara's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. "Edward! Stop. Tell me exactly what happened." He closed his eyes, leaning forward, and began to recount the night. The storm, the mansion, the confrontation. The words tumbled out, raw, jagged, as if speaking them aloud might somehow make them less real. "She provoked me," he said, voice trembling. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't stop myself. I pressed too hard and she didn't fight anymore." Clara's face went pale. Her hands shook as she clutched the arm of the chair. "Edward! Oh God, this is serious. You could go to prison. This isn't something we can fix quietly." He nodded, eyes hollow. I know, but I can't. I can't turn back. It's done. And if anyone knew, I'd lose everything. My freedom, my name, my life." Clara stepped back, horror and fear mingling in her expression. "You're asking me to help you cover this? To hide a murder?" Edward's eyes burned with desperation. "I don't know what else to do. You're the only one I trust. You've always been. The only one who saw me as more than a failure." She shook her head, tears welling. "Edward, I loved you. I still do, but this, I can't. You've crossed a line I cannot follow. You have to turn yourself in, or what?" His voice rose, a mix of anger and pleading. "Or Charles inherits everything. Or Margaret's death becomes my shame forever. I can't lose again, Clara. I can't." The apartment felt impossibly small. Shadows clung to the corners, wrapping around them both. Clara's eyes darted toward the street, imagining police arriving, imagining the headlines. "I can't protect you from this," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "You have to face what you've done. I won't lie for you. I won't hide a corpse." Edward's shoulders slumped, defeated yet defiant. He sank into the chair, drinking again, the whiskey burning down his throat like fire. His gaze drifted to the rain-streaked window, lost in thought, plotting, calculating, despairing. Clara reached the door, pausing. She looked back at him, torn between love and morality. "Edward, this isn't over. The truth has a cost, and you will pay it." She left, the click of the door echoing in the apartment. Edward sat alone, staring at the empty space she left behind, the silence pressing down. He swallowed hard, muttering to himself, "They think I'm done. They have no idea. Edward barely slept that night. The apartment was silent, yet he felt watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward him, accusing him, reminding him of what he had done. He poured himself another drink, the amber liquid shaking in the glass, and stared at the letter he had stolen from Margaret's study weeks ago. It felt heavier now, a leaden reminder that nothing would ever be the same. The phone rang, sharp and unexpected, making him jump. He snatched it from the table, voice hoarse. "Hello, Mr. Harrow?" The voice was neutral, professional. "Detective Carlyle, we need to speak with you regarding your aunt, Margaret Harrow." The glass nearly slipped from his hand. I'm fine. Please, it won't take long. Just some questions." Edward swallowed, forcing calm into his tone. "Yes, of course, when? Now, we're in the area. May we come by?" He hung up before she could respond. The room felt smaller, air thick with tension. His mind raced. He had imagined this moment countless times since that night, but never like this. So close, so inevitable. He poured more whiskey, trying to steady himself. The doorbell rang again. He opened it to find Detective Carlyle and a uniformed officer. Their expressions were polite but unyielding, and Edward felt a cold finger of dread press against his spine. "Mr. Harrow, thank you for agreeing to speak with us," Carlyle said. "May we come in?" Edward stepped aside, swallowing hard as they entered. Every creak of the floor beneath their feet sounded amplified. He poured tea for them, hands trembling so much he nearly spilled. "We understand this is a difficult time," Carlyle began, sitting across from him. "We simply need to ask some routine questions about your aunt and her last days." Edward nodded, voice tight. "Of course, anything you need." The questioning began gently, probing for details about Margaret's schedule, her acquaintances, any recent visitors. Edward answered carefully, calculating each word, each pause. But even in his carefulness, anxiety clawed at him. Every question felt like a trap. "Can you tell me about the evening of the 2nd? Carlyle asked, pen poised above a notebook. Edward froze for a heartbeat. The night flashed in his mind. Rain, shadows, the confrontation, her eyes widening, the suffocating press of his hands on her neck. He forced a smile. I was at home that evening, drinking mostly, alone. Alone. Carlyle's eyes narrowed slightly. "Any friends, acquaintances, anyone who can confirm that?" Edward shook his head. "No, no one. I prefer solitude." Silence followed. He thought he heard the rain pounding harder outside, matching the pounding of his heart. "Did your aunt express any concerns recently?" Carlyle continued. "Anything about family finances or her will?" Edward hesitated. He had rehearsed his answers countless times. He forced calm. "She mentioned nothing. We spoke occasionally, politely, as family does. Nothing alarming." The detective scribbled notes, occasionally glancing up, piercing him with those careful, calculating eyes. Edward felt each gaze like a needle under his skin. "Mr. Harrow," Carlyle said finally, setting down the pen. "We have statements from staff and neighbours that suggest unusual activity that night. Doors opening, voices raised. Can you explain that?" Edward's mind raced. He had left the door slightly ajar when he fled Margaret's room. Could someone have seen him? Heard him? Perhaps I was restless," he said. "I might have gone for a walk, storming about, alone. I was upset, yes." Carlyle leaned forward slightly. "Upset about what?" Edward swallowed. Every fibre of his being screamed to keep quiet. He had rehearsed everything, yet words faltered. "Family matters," he muttered, voice tight. "Disagreements. Nothing serious. She's a strong woman. Always precise with her words. I may have misinterpreted them." The detective's pen moved, recording his response. Edward's palms were slick with sweat. He tried to focus on the tea, on the porcelain cup, anything to distract from the gnawing fear curling inside him. "And the butler?" Carlyle continued. "Did he see or hear anything unusual?" Edward shook his head rapidly. "He sleeps early. Nothing unusual." Carlyle studied him for a long moment, then leaned back. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow. That will be all for now." They rose, and Edward walked them to the door, his stomach knotting. He watched their departure, noting each detail, every movement. Once the door clicked closed, he slid to the floor, pressing his forehead into his knees. He could hear the clock ticking, see the rain streaming down the glass, and feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. He had thought he could escape the consequences, but already they were creeping closer, like shadows in the corners of his mind. In the days that followed, paranoia consumed him. Servants whispered. Neighbours glanced too long, and every knock at the door made him flinch. He avoided calls, changed routines, and watched the street from behind drawn curtains. Each police car, each flashing light in the distance, sent him into spirals of panic. Edward's nights became feverish. Dreams of Margaret returned, accusing, judgmental, her face pale and still. Sometimes he saw Clara standing at the window, her expression torn, as though she could read his thoughts. He muttered to himself, pacing, drinking, rehearsing alibis and lies until the room seemed to close in around him. He began to make mistakes. Details in his stories didn't align. A neighbor's testimony contradicted him. The butler, loyal but observant, recalled movements that Edward had forgotten. Small, seemingly inconsequential observations became glaring inconsistencies. And with each inconsistency, the walls of his carefully constructed world crumbled further. Edward realized he was no longer running from the law. He was running from himself, from the knowledge that he could not maintain the illusion forever. By the end of the week, he was a man fraying at the edges, sleepless, haunted, and tense. He stared at the letter from Margaret on his desk, at the whiskey on the table, at the shadows gathering in the corners of his apartment. He whispered into the darkness, "They are closing in, and soon nothing will save me." The cracks in the alibi were no longer abstract. They were tangible, breathing down his neck, echoing in every room, every mirror, every pulse in his veins. Edward understood finally that the night he thought he controlled, the night of blood and betrayal, was now controlling him. And soon, the law would step through the door, cold and inevitable, to claim him.